This is a story of a man who attempted suicide 3 times and how he turned his life around and the 3 core lessons that I learned from his recovery journey. So let's rewind the clocks and start from the beginning. So I first met my client when he gave me a call and he was telling me how bad his PTSD was getting. He was having nightmares all night. He was screaming out his spouse and his kids, and he was having flashbacks during the day. He couldn't hold a job or anything like that. His life was absolutely horrible. And even worse is he was on the verge of divorce and actually losing his kids. So he was going through all of that as well. And to numb all of the pain that he was going through, he went to the bottle, he went to drink, and he would get drunk almost every single night. And when he did get drunk, he would yell, he would scream, he would run around the house and grab things and break things, punch holes in walls, and it was just a complete mess. And all of that pain and all the yelling and all the screaming that he did led to a massive sense of internal guilt because he loved and he truly cared about his family. But all the pain just built up inside of him. He started yelling and screaming at people in his life. And since he loved them, it built that massive level of guilt and shame, which then caused all that anger that he was projecting outwards to start being projected inwards. So he started really blaming himself a lot and eventually self-harming. And that would literally be him beating himself up or slamming his head against the wall until he passed out. So he'd wake up after knocking himself unconscious, right? So that's what he would go through. He would break things, he'd feel guilty, he'd feel the shame, beat himself up physically until he literally beat himself to a point where he got unconscious. And when he woke up from being unconscious, he didn't remember anything, right? He only remembered what people told him after the fact that he did. So he was absolutely terrible. He was in an awful, awful scenario when I first met him. And he really was at the end of his rope. He wanted to end his life. But the reason why I tell this story is not to get all of you guys sad and, depressed, because there is actually a positive twist on this story. And I truly believe in telling stories, but stories that are inspirational. And his story, he gave me his permission to share it, I believe can help a lot of people who are out there who are struggling with suicidal thoughts, suicidal ideation, or maybe have had several suicide attempts, or are just struggling with some very intrusive negative thoughts. Because that was one of the biggest things that my client went through were those negative, intrusive thoughts about himself and his past. So even if you're not suicidal or you don't know someone who's suicidal, this video will help you with those negative thoughts that may be recurring in your life. So you definitely want to stick around to the end because that's when I'm going to share the 3 lessons. The first thing I'm going to walk through though, are the 4 core problems that he and I observed as we worked together. And that really is the first step. If you want to solve any problem in life, you have to ask yourself, where is this problem coming from? So that you can actually go and identify the root cause. Because if we just keep dealing with these emotions, or we just cope, or we just, go drink and try to numb all the pain, all that does is it pushes it away temporarily for it to come back, generally even stronger. So we want to dig in. And that's the first thing that we did, was we dug in and identified the root causes of why he wanted to kill himself. And it's a really big subject, but I want everybody to know that it's not a life sentence. Like, you don't feel that way forever, right? And generally it's just because the pain has gotten so high in your life. That's at least what happened in this case. His pain got so high that he just could not deal with it anymore. I mean, maybe some of you guys are going through that right now, but just imagining, having those flashbacks during the day, screaming at his wife and his kids, the guilt, the self-harm, and then the consequential guilt from all of that, combined and compounding on each other over time. I can understand why he felt that, and I don't blame anybody. And before I jump into this any further, I do want to say, as a disclaimer, this is just what I observed with one client. And if you need immediate help with suicide, having suicidal thoughts, call the suicidal hotline. I'll put it on the screen here or down in the description. It's 100% free and 100% worth it. So if you're ever struggling with that, or one night you're just having these thoughts, you can't get them out of your head, just know that you're worth it to stick around. Get help. There are a lot of people out there who want to help you. You are worth that help. You're worthy of that help. And know that it's possible to solve all the problems that you're going through right now, even though they may seem completely overwhelming. And what I'm going through today is just one client, but I've done this with multiple clients in different arenas, with different sources and different root causes for the reasons on why they wanted to commit suicide. So before I dive into the problems though, I want to teach something that I like to call the master algorithm, right? So the master algorithm. And really what this is how one thought or how traumas in your past can compound and turn into this massive negative feedback loop. Because really that's what happened, especially in this client's life, because I'm talking about this specific client. He experienced multiple traumas in his past, and they went completely unresolved all through his childhood, all through his young adultshood, whatever you call that. But they were never dealt with and they were never healed. So they had all of these downstream effects. It wasn't just the trauma itself, it was actually the impact of the trauma and the compounded impact of the trauma, and what I'm going to go through here in the master algorithm. So basically, what happened to this client here, and what happens to a lot of people, is that they experience a trauma, right? So the first thing experienced is a trauma. All right, so they have this painful trauma in their life. And what this trauma does is it triggers certain thoughts. Right? So the trauma then creates these thoughts, and obviously emotions are attached with that as well. But then these thoughts are repeated since the trauma isn't resolved, and you keep reliving that trauma over and over and over and over and over again, right? That's what happens when you get triggered, is that your body is basically reacting to an external stimulus that reminds you subconsciously of the trauma. So then your subconscious mind reacts as though you are in the trauma again. So you react in the exact same way. So you don't just go through a trauma once, you go through it multiple times, and that's why it's so painful. And if you don't deal with the underlying root cause of the trauma, that's why it will just keep destroying your life over and over and over on repeat until you actually solve the root of the problem via triggers and things like that. So these thoughts, the trauma happens once initially, but then it keeps happening again and again and again and again, right? So you start having these negative thoughts over and over again, and eventually these thoughts, they turn into beliefs, which then are generally unquestioned, right? So beliefs are the things that our emotions come out of and all of our actions come out of it, right? So after beliefs, your beliefs create your actions, right? So you have the trauma that creates your thoughts, that creates your beliefs, that creates your actions, right? And generally what happens, I'll go with the example here. My client went through a trauma. He had negative thoughts about himself. Things like, I'm not worthy, I'm not good enough, my life was bad and will always be bad. I will never get better, and it's all my fault. So he had like negative thoughts like that, which would then, over time, were repeated in his mind, and he didn't even know it, and started to create these beliefs. And then since he had these beliefs that he believed to be true, that he was worthless, he acted out those beliefs. And what happens after the actions is like, it doesn't stop here at the actions, because the actions give you a certain result in your life. You take an action and you experience something in your life, right? So then what do you do with the experience? Well, you interpret it in some way. Another way to call the interpretations are thoughts. So what happens here is we have a feedback mechanism. So the actions here, this is not a closed system. I mean, it is a closed system. It's not an open system. It doesn't just end. It's a closed system. So your actions go back around, they feed back around, and they influence the thoughts that you had. So in his case, he would have, he would have the trauma, or maybe he would get triggered, he'd have the negative thoughts, have the negative beliefs, and then his action would be, or one of the actions that he would have would be yelling, screaming, getting drunk, beating himself up, and then come back around up top. He'd feel guilty about that. He'd beat himself up even more. He would tell himself why his life was so bad and why it would continue to be bad. And he started stacking all of these reasons for why he would always be that way. And what this is called, it's a negative feedback loop, right? So this loop here, in my client's case, I don't know if you can see that, it's the negative feedback loop. And this is how people just think, oh, a trauma, first of all, people think, trauma just happens once, which isn't true. It happens once. And then all the downstream effects, they happen, they don't just happen once, they happen again and again and again. So you re-experience this and you have this negative feedback loop that eventually spirals you down to the point where you want to take your own life. Now I call this the master algorithm because it's not just about trauma. Like this affects everything in your life. Everything in your life is determined by this. All your beliefs will create, all your actions will reinforce your thoughts. And then that will dictate the results you get, how good you feel, your emotions, everything comes down to this. So every problem that I'm going to list moving forward, I'm going to plug into this master algorithm and show you how all of his problems were actually causing him to compound and spiral out of control into a place where he wanted to take his own life, right? So let me go through the first problem that my client had that we kind of diagnosed together. And one of them, here, the first one that we saw, or one of them that we saw, was loneliness, right? Right? So loneliness within himself and without himself. So inside, internally and externally. Because people think of loneliness as like, oh, it's I don't have other people in my life. But loneliness can also be you don't have yourself in your own life. You're not in your own corner, right? Which that's even more dangerous. And that's always the main thing and the first thing that I address with people. Because this might sound like a weird concept, but you have these different parts of your psyche. And when you experience a trauma, those parts of your psyche, I'm going to go into more depth about this later in the video. But when you experience a trauma, parts of your psyche get severed and pushed away. So, for example, when my client had the trauma, there were parts of his psyche that he didn't want to face because of the pain. And it's kind of obvious to acknowledge and see, because he kept pushing those parts of his, trauma away. He pushed those thoughts away, he pushed the pain away, right? And that caused his mind and his psyche to become very fragmented and separated, right? And he didn't care very much for himself. So not only was he lonely, but he was beating himself up. He was beating himself senseless, psychologically first, and then in real life, secondarily. So everything always happens up here first. It's like if you're beating yourself, especially if you're beating yourself up externally, you're beating yourself up internally in some way, shape, or form. But internally along as externally. So he also didn't feel, he felt lonely in his life as well, because he didn't feel worthy to be around other people, because he felt a great deal of shame for, first of all, treating his family, the people he loved, that way. Second of all, he didn't feel worthy because he couldn't hold down a job, right? And he was ashamed of just being in pain and terrified of having a panic attack or a flashback in front of a friend or a stranger or anybody else. So his anxiety just shot through the roof, and all of that compounded on itself as well. And this just reinforces the master algorithm as well, right? So you have the trauma, you have the thoughts, you have the beliefs. He would think, oh, I'm not worthy, right? And that would create the belief. And since I'm not worthy, I'm going to take this action of not going out, not meeting people, right? Which then came back around and be like, you know what? I am not worthy. See, I'm a terrible person because I can't even go out. I can't even get myself to go out and meet some people, right? So the loneliness here was a problem that fed into the master algorithm and fed the feedback loop in a negative way. Now, the second problem here that we identified, the second one was hopelessness about the future. So I'll just write hopelessness. And this is a very common thing. It's not just common for, people who are suicidal, who have suicidal thoughts. It's common for a lot of people who have PTSD or have gone through any sort of trauma. Because what they do is they look at the past, and this is what I did, and this is what my client did, is that my client was looking at the past, came up with all these reasons, these beliefs, that formed his beliefs, of why his life was bad and would continue to be bad. So if you asked him, why are you hopeless about the future? He would give me all these reasons from the past. And that really, all that was is it reinforced this belief that my life will not get better. It will always be this way. And since he believed that, he acted that out, and his life did not get any better, right? So that's the second problem that we identified there. And obviously that's how it reinforces. Since he was hopeless, since that he projected his past onto his future and believed that his future was going to be exactly like his past, he took actions to reinforce that belief, which then reinforced that entire cycle right there. All right, so the third problem here that he faced was he didn't believe it was possible to heal. So I'll just write down impossible. He thought it was impossible to heal, right? He didn't believe that it was possible for him. Well, first of all, he didn't believe recovery or healing from suicidal thoughts was impossible. One big reason was that he had these thoughts for a very, very long time. He had multiple traumas when he was in childhood, multiple traumas, throughout his life, and then everything that compounded throughout this cycle here. So he had a lot of reasons to believe why it wasn't possible. But on top of that, throughout his life, he had gone to experts, he has gone to therapists, he went to doctors, and all of them said, this is something that you will have to live with forever. Trauma permanently changes your brain, and there's nothing you can do about it except cope and get by, and accept this as your new normal. And it's sickening how often that I hear that, and I love to bring it up as much as possible because that's simply not true. And I love stories like this and sharing stories like this because they undeniably prove that that's not true. So he didn't believe it was possible to heal. He didn't believe it was possible for him or his ability to heal. He didn't believe in his ability to actually change himself. So, and also, side note, a great belief for you to build is to believe in your ability that you can figure it out, right? Believe that you can figure it out. So you don't need to know all the solutions to all your problems. You don't need to know everything. All you have to do to be successful in many areas of your life is believe that you will be able to figure it out. So just as a side note, that's a really powerful belief on your recovery journey for you to build. And I would write that down. I'd even, write an affirmation or something about that and around that, and really start working on the belief that you can figure things out, right? That things aren't impossible, that things don't have to be perfect, that you're never going to be perfect, that you don't have all the solutions, but you can figure it out. You can learn, you can fumble your way through it. And by the way, everybody fumbles their way through every single problem in life anyways. You're not any different. You're not special in the fact that you don't know what to do and you don't know how to do things. It's like nobody knows really what they're doing and they kind of fumble their way through it and get better with time. So his belief, right? This is how it fits in the master algorithm. Since he believed it was impossible, he took actions that then aligned with that belief. So he stopped getting help. He started, and that reinforced the hopelessness, right? So he stopped trying to get better. That's the first thing, right? He just stopped trying to get help. right? Until things got so bad that he knew he had to change. And that's when I first met him, was that, he went through portions of his life. Like before I talked to him, it had been over a decade, maybe almost a decade, where he went without help or trying to fix the problem, right? So he went all this time without trying to fix the problem because he believed it was hopeless and impossible to solve it, right? So these are all the problems. And like I said, after I identify these problems, I'm going to go through the 3 lessons that actually will show you how we broke these problems within him. And if you were facing similar problems, how you can also do the same. So the 4th problem here was apathy, depression, and didn't want to do anything. And what you can see here is that all these things kind of fed into each other. Apathy and depression, right? So again, this goes along with the last one because it stemmed from his lack of belief in the future of getting better, right? So since he believed it was impossible, he then believed everything was hopeless, and that made him be apathetic and depressed, right? So those were kind of the reactions to these other beliefs. Now, this last problem that we had, and this one might be an obvious one because of the story, but it was probably the biggest one. And if you're going through this problem, it will probably be the best place to start, right? And again, in a few minutes, I'm going to give you some tools to actually defend yourself against this. And really, I guess it's not the best word isn't defend, but combat it. Self-blame. Blaming yourself for everything. He would blame himself for every single thing that went wrong in his life, whether it was his fault or not. And this is where some people get mixed up because like, oh, I thought I'm supposed to take responsibility. It's like responsibility and blame are 2 vastly different things, right? So responsibility is owning it, not blaming anybody, right? So many people misconstrue responsibility for blaming themselves. Like, oh, if I'm taking responsibility for something, what it means is I'm placing blame on myself. But no, like responsibility is not blame. It's very different. So we never want to use blame at all. We never want to point the finger at somebody else, and we don't want to point the finger at us. We want to own it. We don't like blame involves or insinuates a negative connotation, whereas responsibility is owning it. It's accepting the situation, the reality, but you're not blaming and putting somebody down for it. But my client here, he felt an immense amount of guilt for his trauma and for his symptoms, right? So he felt guilty for the things that he did in the past with the traumas. He blamed himself for the traumas that he went through, and then he blamed himself for all of the reactions to the trauma throughout his entire life. And that caused him, so since he blamed himself, he believed he was worthy of that blame. He took actions where he mentally beat himself up, but he literally physically beat himself up. And this then fed the feedback loop so much. He blamed himself so much. He hated himself so much that it fed around to the action of him attempting to take his own life. It did not start there. He did not come out of the womb wanting to end his life. It was a cause and effect relationship. Since all of these things started to stack on top of each other, the momentum just got stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger until it felt like he had his only option, the only action that he believed was possible for him was to take his own life, right? So those are the 5 problems I identified with him. But the good news, there's really good news about all of this. It might sound a little depressing, but the good news is that all of this can be changed and that we did change all of this with him. It was a process. It did not happen overnight. He put in a ton of hours to fix this, but I was able to help him to turn this around and teach him some tools that he could use independent outside of therapy to help him reverse this negative feedback loop and actually turn it into a positive feedback loop to the point where he's now happy, his relationship is fine, he's loving his life, and he can't even imagine being back in that place where he wanted to hurt himself, or he wanted to kill himself. So this negative feedback loop, it can work for you or it can work against you. And if it's working against you right now, as even the worst it can get, where you are thinking about taking your own life, just know that you can reverse this. It is 100% possible for you to reverse this, and that is the message that you need to hear. Now, I want to go through 3 lessons, right? That 3 lessons/solutions that I went through with my client that helped him, right? And my hopes is that by going through what helped him, you'll be able to pick some things out, and hopefully they will work for you as well. But I'm just going to go through some principles and some processing tools that I helped him with that literally turned all of this around for him. So the first lesson here was, he had to confront his emotions. He had to stop running away from the pain, right? So he had to stop using all those negative coping mechanisms. So for him, it was drinking, watching TV, overeating, even beating himself up, right? He had to stop all of these negative actions, all of these negative reactions to the trauma and the pain, and start seeing pain as part of himself that he should actually give a damn about. So these parts of yourself that you are scared of, all of this pain that you don't want to feel, they are parts of you. They are you. And most of the time, people look externally and say, so-and-so is not giving me the love I deserve, right? Or so-and-so is not helping me in the way that I want to be helped or need to be helped. But whenever I dig into that with a client, I always ask the question, well, is it the other person, or do you also not give yourself the love and the respect and the belief that you deserve? Because generally what happens is that and this is what happened with my client, since he didn't believe in himself, he put up with things in his life that caused, or like when other people didn't believe in him or treated him with disrespect, he would take that on. But the first big shift that I had to teach him was that pain was his friend. It's not something to be feared, but something to be loved. Pain is literally the path for you to heal. And the only reason, and now there are techniques, now like pain is the path to heal, if you have the right processing tools in order to confront and heal the pain, right? But pain is the path. Once you know the tools, and I did a video right before this video teaching you an extremely powerful tool and teaching you the 2 fundamentals to processing any trauma permanently. Once you know those tools, and you can go back and you can watch that, but once you know those tools, you need to see pain as your friend and not fear it, start to love it, start to go towards it and use pain as a compass, because that's where the problem lies. You cannot solve the problem by avoiding the problem. Pain is the problem. And if pain is the problem, you can't avoid it and expect the pain to go away. And there's so many things that people do to avoid the pain, whether it's drinking, video games, medication, whatever it is, smoking, drugs, or even types of therapy where you're just like venting and venting and venting and venting. It's like, well, you're not actually dealing with the problem. So it's not something to be feared. It's something to be loved. Pain is a part of you. It needs to be understood, loved, accepted, and comforted, right? It's not meant to be beat up. It's not meant to be pushed away. It is literally a part of you. And that's how I want you to see pain. I don't want you to see pain as something terrifying or some demon. It is literally a part of you. And you need to see that part of you, and you need to want and learn to understand it. You need to love it. You need to accept it, and you need to comfort it, and you need to coach it to help that part of you get better. And that's how you can take that severed part of your psyche, help it, save it, rescue it, heal it, love it, and reintegrate it back into your life, where it is no longer wreaking all this havoc. It's no longer causing all these symptoms because you've solved the problem. So that was the first one. The first lesson that, my client learned was that he had to confront the pain. He had to see pain as something good. He had to see pain as something good for him. So the second lesson here was how to actually confront that part of his psyche that wanted to commit suicide. So the second thing, once he saw pain as something good, not something to be feared, but something to love and to accept because it was a part of him, he had to learn how to actually confront, and maybe a better word would be communicate and connect with that part of his psyche that wanted to commit suicide, right? So in general, before I just said pain, right? But the specific pain that he had to confront, that he had to communicate with, was the part of him, the part of his psyche, the painful part of his psyche that wanted to commit suicide, right? And that's a really scary place to be. And I also want to say, there's a caveat. You do not need to attack this problem first. If this is a really scary problem, before we got to this point in confronting this suicidal part of his mind, we confronted many other parts of his mind. But at end point, what truly solved the suicidal problems that he was having was confronting that part of his mind that wanted to commit suicide. It's like, well, there is a part of you that wants to commit suicide. Like, we use that terminology all the time. It's like, oh, there's a part of me that wants to do this, there's a part of me that wants to do that, but I don't really want to do that. But if you're being honest with yourself, the reality is there is a part, for my client, there was a part that wanted to end his own life. The majority of his mind did not, but there was a part. And for the longest time, he did not want to accept that. He did not want to accept that there was a part that wanted to end his own life. And why would you want to? Like, nobody really wants to admit that. And plus, you also, like, logically, when you think about things, you're like, when you're feeling good and you're not, consumed with all these emotions, you can rationally think, and you know that you don't want to kill yourself, and that's not the right path forward. But when you get consumed with that part, when you get consumed with that suicidal part, it is still there. There is that part that's there. So when we're grounded and we're calm, we push that part of our psyche away, but it doesn't get rid of it. It just pushes it away until it gets triggered, until it comes back. So that's why we need to confront it, because it is there. If we are being honest with ourselves, and I had to get my client to be brutally honest with himself and have him admit, yes, there is that part of my mind. Even though I know it's not the best solution, even though it's not what I truly want, it still exists. Because if we can't acknowledge that we have part of our minds, if he couldn't acknowledge that he had part of his mind that wanted to end his own life, then he wouldn't be able to solve the problem, right? It's like what I said earlier. It's like, if you can't identify a problem, you can't solve it. And if we are spending all of our time pushing all these problems away and not confronting them and lying to ourselves, the problem still exists. The only difference is that we're lying to ourselves about. We're telling ourselves it doesn't exist, but in reality it does. So when you tell yourself, when you tell yourself something doesn't exist, but it does exist, it's a lie, first of all, but the problem still exists. It's still going to ruin your life. Whether you want it to be there or not, it is there. And for my client, that part of him was there, and it was very hard for him to admit that. It's very hard for every client that I had to confront that suicidal part of themselves. It was very hard for them to admit that that part existed. Because rationally, we do not want to do that. Rationally, we know that's not the right option, right? So we push it far and far away. So my client had to confront that specific part, right? And that part of his mind, that part of his psyche had to be understood, had to be loved, had to be accepted, had to be comforted, and he had to stop blaming that part. He had to stop pushing that part away. Instead of pushing it away and beating the crap out of it, he had to pull it in, he had to hug it, he had to embrace it. Not literally, obviously, but you had to approach it as a friend, as a loved one, as a coach. And that's a good mentality when you're dealing with these parts of your psyche, when you're dealing with these painful parts of your mind. You want to approach it like you're approaching a friend because it's you. It's you. Like when you're approaching these painful parts of your mind, it's like you need to approach them like there's someone you care about. Because if you don't care about yourself, it's going to be very hard just to go through life in general. It's like you need to be your number one supporter. And that's a 100% internal game, right? So first of all, he had to be honest and be like, and admit to himself, yes, this part of my mind exists. There is a part of me that wants to commit suicide, right? Then he had to confront that part. He had to communicate with that part. He had to approach it as a friend, as a loved one, as a coach, right? And then the last thing he had to do is he had to transform that part, right? So he actually had to help that mind, that part of his mind, heal, to go through the recovery process, to identify its beliefs, to help it release its emotions, to help shift the beliefs that it had from negative to positive, right? And identify all the problems to why it wanted to kill itself, right? That part, like you're having a conversation. The way to kind of conceptualize this is that you can literally visualize this psychological part of yourself. It's very helpful to visualize it outside of your body, and then you having that separation, having a conversation with it. And again, you don't start with the most difficult thing unless you're at a level where you can confront that part of you. It helps to confront smaller things before you confront the big, massive thing. And that in this specific case, so that you build up the skill and you know how to do it. But he had to have a conversation with that part. He had to solve the problems. He had to change his fundamental beliefs. He had to release the emotions with that. And again, I would check out the video before this video about how to specifically do that. And he also had to reintegrate it into his psyche, so that that part of himself was no longer destructive. It no longer had the belief that it was worthless and that it was deserving of dying, right? Because that was the core belief that he had. When he had that conversation with that part of his mind, that part of him had the belief that he was not good enough, that he was worthless, that his life was bad and will always be bad, that it will never get better, that it was all his fault. And for all of those reasons, he was deserving of ending his own life. He wasn't deserving of life, right? So he had to go there and break all of those beliefs with that part and release all of the associated emotions with that to actually transform it, right? So that was the second lesson there. The third lesson here is he had to change those foundational beliefs that I just talked about, right? So when he was talking with that part, he identified 5 core beliefs, right? One of them being, I'm worthless. So when he talked with that part of his psyche, it was, I'm worthless. The second one is, I'm not good enough. The third one is, my life was always bad before and will always be bad in the future. The fourth one was, I will never get better. It will always be this way, having that impossible belief. And the fifth one being, it's all my fault. So he had to go there and change all of that. Now, I want to give you 2 tips on how to start changing these beliefs in your own life. And these two tips for him were very, very, very important, right? So these were 2 things that he utilized in his own recovery that allowed him to, like, very simple tips, but very powerful, right? That allowed him to change these beliefs on a fundamental level throughout his day, right? So the first step, one, is to monitor your self-talk. Your mind is always going. You're always having thoughts. And if you don't monitor it, if you don't police your thoughts, the likelihood is that you are going to go to these negative thoughts, especially, and this is where most people find themselves when they have PTSD or have gone through trauma, but especially when you're on a negative feedback loop spiral. So if you have a tendency already to go negative, the likelihood is that you're not aware of all those negative thoughts, and there are so many negative thoughts that are happening under your awareness that are reinforcing this master algorithm right here. So the first thing is you want to take control of the thoughts right here. So all self-talk is taking control of the thoughts. So this is what you want to start with throughout your day. You want to become aware of, what am I thinking about, right? What are you thinking about right now? What are you thinking about throughout your entire day? You want to monitor your thoughts. And the second tip here is to have a default affirmation that resonates with you, right? So that when you don't know what to say, or you don't know how to shift your negative thoughts in the moment, or your negative self-talk in the moment to positive, when you don't know what to say, you have a default affirmation to go to. And my two favorite ones are just generally the simplest ones, which is I love you, and the second one being I believe in you. And those are just good foundational things that are very simple to remember, like I love you, I believe in you, right? That if you start doing that and you start actually believing that you are worthy of love, and that you actually start believing in your ability to do things, you will start, even just by saying those two affirmations, those two beliefs, if you just keep repeating those two beliefs when you don't know what to say, what you'll find is that your mind will start to find references that support those beliefs unconsciously. Like they'll just start to pop in your head. If you just say, I love you, I love you, I love you, or I believe in you, I believe in you, you'll be like, I believe in you because of this. And you'll start to get all of these things. So start stacking all of the positive. So the two tips again are to monitor your self-talk. So as you go throughout your day, you want to monitor all the negative thoughts that you have. You want to swap it to a positive one, and you want to have that default affirmation. And if you want to learn how to change the fundamental beliefs, those foundational beliefs that my client went through, and learn the exact process that I brought him through, the process that he went to all of those parts, or the suicidal part, how he helped that suicidal part of himself change those beliefs, watch that video here, and I will see you in the next one. Make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you later.